Okay, let's just dive right in. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating document, Tamil social formation in Sri Lanka, a historical outline. We're going to take an objective, scholarly look at the deep historical roots and the parallel evolutions of this specific South Asian social structure. It's kind of like putting together a giant historical puzzle, and we'll be relying strictly on the archaeological evidence and primary arguments the author brings to the table.
To keep things organized, we've got a structured, four-act, chronological roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the foundations in Act 1, move to the rise of Jaffna in Act 2, examine parallel paths of identity in Act 3, and wrap up with the historical buffer in Act 4. Let's get to it.
So Act 1, the foundations. This is where we need to completely rethink how we approach the earliest origins of this society.
The author makes a really strong case right off the bat for a historiographical reappraisal. Basically, we can't just rely on conventional Buddhist chronicles, things like the Vayapalatal, to reconstruct Tamil history. It just doesn't give us the full objective picture. Instead, the text asserts we have to use rigorous scientific tools. We're talking archaeology, cultural anthropology, and historical linguistics. That is how you actually get to the truth of the past.
And a perfect example of this archaeological approach is the dolmen, a megalithic burial monument found at Katiravelli in the eastern province. What's absolutely crucial about this is that it gives us tangible physical proof of the earliest human habitations in the area, and those habitations were deeply rooted in a shared cultural stratum that connects directly to South India. Which brings us to what's known as the megalithic culture. Around 500 to 100 BC, this culture laid down a common foundation across both South India and Sri Lanka. They brought some absolute game changers to the region: iron technology, permanent settlements, distinctive black and red wares pottery, and, really importantly, early tank-irrigated agriculture. This shared megalithic stratum, that's the true common ancestor of the entire region.
Now, understanding that shared ancestor leads to a massive shift in how we view history. The text argues that the evidence clearly shows there are literally no foundational racial differences among Sinhalese, Tamils, and South Indians. The author actually posits that the idea of a mass Aryan migration is a myth, one formulated by 6th century Buddhist monks. It's a classic example of how early political narratives can totally cloud the actual archaeological facts.
Okay, moving on to Act 2, coastal trade and the emergence of Jaffna. Here's where we see this early agricultural society level up into a globally connected network.
Between 100 BC and 500 AD, trans-oceanic trade just drastically elevated the Jaffna region. Centers like Kontaratai urbanized straight out of that megalithic base we just talked about. Jaffna emerged as a vital principality. And what's wild is that it was growing entirely parallel to Anuradhapura in southern Sri Lanka, and at the exact same time, parallel to major ancient cities in the Tamil country of South India. It became this thriving, cosmopolitan hub.
We can actually see this unique localized culture in the cluster of stupas found at Kontaratai. The architecture is totally distinct. They're built entirely from locally available coral and limestone. The author suggests this represents a sort of Jaffna Buddhism, where the Buddhist faith was adapted to fit the local cultural heritage, perfectly overlapping with those older megalithic burial beliefs. It really shows a society that was highly capable of taking global ideologies and making them their own.
Just to quickly track the broader shifts here, trade elevated Jaffna early on, but when Roman trade eventually declined, regional dynamics shifted. By the 6th century AD, localized regional dynasties started popping up. Zoom ahead to the 10th century, the Chola Empire out of South India becomes a massive influence, giving the region a fresh jolt of energy. And this all ultimately culminates in the 13th century AD with the emergence of the formal Kingdom of Jaffna.
Which brings us right to Act 3, parallel paths and the crystallization of identity. As those regional dynasties really took hold, distinct sociocultural identities began to separate and firmly crystallize.
You can really see this parallel evolution happening between the 6th and 10th centuries. On one hand, in Sri Lanka, Sinhala emerges as a clearly identifiable language, and Buddhism becomes incredibly intertwined with statecraft. But right next door in South India, you have a Brahmanic revival and the Bhakti movement, which actually leads to the virtual extinction of Jainism and Buddhism over there. These are two completely different sociocultural trajectories happening simultaneously.
And this is one of the author's most fundamental points. The Tamil homeland in Sri Lanka is its own distinct social formation. It's got its own specific environment, its own demography, and its own unique history of subsistence. It developed entirely parallel to Tamil South India.
They aren't identical. The source is very clear that the society in Sri Lanka is not just some extension or a carbon copy of Tamil Nadu.
There's an amazing human element backing this up too. Take the traditional Jarmers from Karanagar in Jaffna. Communities like this maintain dialects containing Proto-Dravidian words that you simply will not find anywhere else in Tamil South India today. They held these really unique social roles, acting as heralds, traditional weavers, keepers of family records. For the author, this distinct linguistic and social survival is literal living proof of an independent cultural evolution, totally separated from the mainland.
All right, let's bring it all home with Act 4, Subsistence, Autonomy, and the Historical Buffer. This is where we tie all these historical threads straight into the modern socioeconomic context. The author points out that the colonial era, especially under the British, absolutely eroded the economic independence of this region. The entire economy was forcibly shifted toward Colombo-centric plantations. Because of that, traditional maritime trading routes just collapsed. On top of that, missionary education pushed the local population heavily into white-collar jobs. Suddenly, they were completely cut off from their historic trade networks with South India. The author suggests this led directly into fierce competition for basic subsistence with the populations in the South. This changes how we view the entire dynamic of the island. For centuries, this unique social formation acted as a highly effective historical buffer zone, both geopolitically and culturally, between the Sinhalese systems to the south and the South Indian systems to the north. But once that fundamental economic independence was stripped away, the author contends that the buffer collapsed straight into conflict. Which brings us to a really central quote from the text. The author states, "The present crisis is essentially one of devising socio-political means which will ensure a subsistence pattern for these people in their own land." Basically, they are concluding that the modern crisis fundamentally stems from a massive failure to recognize how absolutely necessary it is to preserve this specific, historically rooted pattern of survival. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. When we look at all of this through the lens of deep history, we really have to ask, how much of our modern geopolitical conflict is actually just a struggle to reclaim fundamental patterns of survival? If a distinct social formation loses its economic autonomy, can any purely political solution truly resolve the crisis? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history behind the headlines.